I hope that cloaking me with this notion of being your mentor is a good thing. But Jan Jan was the first person I met, just about the first student I had when I got to Indiana University after spending 11 years at UC Irvine from 74 to 85, and then I went to Indiana, and Jan was in my first class. And the good thing about Jan being in my first class is that I spent one semester in Indiana, and then I went to Hong Kong as a Fulbright, and so Jan was able to show me the ropes, and I've been going to, as this indicates, I also have the affiliation with the University of Hong Kong and the Faculty of Social Sciences there. So it's a pleasure to be here. I did actually do one thing that sort of mimics, I think, Jan's. What the heck is a salon? All right, so we don't have any of these in Indiana. Now, I don't want to say anything else about Indiana today, but it says a gathering of people under the roof of an inspiring host. Now, I assume this is Jack and Jan, or USC as a whole, held partly to amuse one another and partly to refine the taste and increase the knowledge of participants. Now, I don't know whether I'm the knowledge part or the amusement part. You'll have to judge that after we're done. My wife says that I'm worthless for the amusement part. So, given the fact that what I'm going to say I think is pretty simple and straightforward, all Jan is saying, this is kind of risky for the editor-in-chief of Public Administration Review to be talking about vanishing public administration. But it made good sense at the time. Jan said, why don't you come and talk about public administration? I was trying to figure out what would make some sense. And I came up with this title, Vanishing Public Administration. So let me give you a little quick preview, and the preview is very brief. What am I going to talk about? First of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about good news and bad news for public administration. Fairly briefly, I'll probably try to spend more time on the good news. It occurred to me that if I'm going to be talking about vanishing public administration, that I probably want to say something good to start out, so I don't sort of destroy all my credibility. Then I want to define what I mean by vanishing public administration. And this, in the abstract I sent to Jan, I said, this is partly a function of my research. I could be talking, for instance, about public service motivation, and that's often one of the things I talk about, and people are doing lots of research about that these days. But I also have this role as editor-in-chief of PAR, and having been a professor of public administration, public affairs for the last 41 years, so I don't want to leave out the experience component. So this is really sort of a combination of my research, judgments, thinking about the field, and a variety of other things, including my recent experience as editor-in-chief of Public Administration Review. So I want to talk a little bit about vanishing public administration, and then I want to talk about what should we do about it. And I thought, well, maybe it isn't what can we do about it, maybe not what we should do. So some people may have different views about what we ought to be doing about vanishing public administration, if it is vanishing, but you sort of be the judge whether I'm using the right language here. So let me sort of first of all say something about the good news and bad news. Now, as Jan said, I'm not trying to sell memberships in ASPA, American Society for Public Administration, where they're relatively inexpensive these days, but you can also get this online at your nearest university library, and I certainly recommend that. The other thing is that people don't get a chance to see. I love the cover, created it myself with some designers, and so I sort of like to share it. But the other thing is we get 10 or 15 copies each month. And so if I sort of leave them sit on the shelf, all of a sudden I got 2 or 3 shelves of 100 journals, and I don't know what to do with them. So I bring them along, and it's useful for those people that haven't encountered the journal directly or gone to the USC website where you download your electronic journals. But so I brought those along for you to take a look at, and there's a 75-1 and 75-2. But this is a special year in the history of this journal. We turned 75. And I editorialized with sort of a happy birthday editorial the first issue of this year. We've published something like 3,000 articles. One of the exercises we've done recently is I've asked the editorial board 2 years ago as a way of sort of to recognize the legacy and recognize what this journal has published, to select our 75 most influential articles. That seemed to me to make sense, given the fact that we were turning 75. You know, if we, and we don't have one article per year, we didn't do it that way. But if you look at the journal and what it's published over the years, there's a pretty substantial and significant body of knowledge, literature there. I like to point out the fact that 4 of these 75 articles have been written, authored by Nobel laureates, Herbert Simon having done 3 of them in the 1940s, 60s, and 70s, so a period of 30 years. Some people say to me, well, Simon left public administration. Well, if he left public administration, he didn't forget to keep submitting his articles to Public Administration Review, because they kept rolling in and he kept being accepted and published. Eleanor Ostrom, another one of Jan's mentors and a colleague of mine, contributed a significant piece with her husband Vincent. It was actually 1972, I think it was 71 or 72 on public choice. The research, for instance, on public service motivation, the first piece on public service motivation, I contributed to the 50th anniversary issue of Public Administration Review. Probably the most significant piece on networks, and networks are popular these days, Larry O'Toole contributed in 1997. So if you look at sort of the legacy, there's a lot there. And the good thing is, for those of you that are doctoral students or simply want to assign articles to your doctoral students, you can go to this website, www.publicadministrationreview.org, find the names and titles of all 75 articles, click on and read all the articles. One of the things we've been doing this year is we've been publishing retrospectives on some of the articles. For instance, the most cited piece in the history of Public Administration Review, many of you are probably familiar with it, is Charles Lindblom's The Science of Muddling Through. I was able to engage Jonathan Bender from Stanford Business School to write a retrospective on what was it, what difference did it make, and where do we go forward from here with respect to decision-making theory. Bender got this brilliant idea. Why don't I send this to Ed? Ed is the sort of the name by which Charles Lindblom goes. Most people think Charles Lindblom is dead. At least the last I checked, he wasn't. But Lindblom is 97 years old, and lo and behold, he responded to Bender with a beautiful email complimenting him on the article. So it's unfortunately, we don't have all of our authors still with us, but Lindblom, among others, is with us. So we've been trying to, and Janet and Bob contributed a piece on revisiting the new public service, and so we've got a number of articles that are coming out in our 75th to recognize some of the pieces, only about 10 of the 75, but sort of significant contributions to the literature over time. So I'm very proud and pleased to be the editor-in-chief of Public Administration Review. It happens to be the 75th year, but looking back at it, and of course also looking back and not trying to justify 40 years in public administration, but looking back at the journal, I've had my love-hate relationship with it over time, and all of you that may have contributed or read PAR from time to time probably have had your love-hate relationship with the journal. But there's really a lot there, and sort of a rich history of the field, the intellectual history of the field in Public Administration Review. Now, the other thing I ought to note, and some people have asked me this already, but we have lots of good young scholars in the field of public administration. Although I had a conversation with one of your colleagues yesterday, said that you maybe came up with a failed search this year. I think the good news was that it failed because you didn't get the guy from Indiana again. So we're happy about that. But the question is, how deep is the bench? One of my recommendations was that you ought to be looking, as far as a bench, you ought to maybe look beyond the confines of America. I helped place a young scholar who's a graduate of Seoul National University at an American university this last year. I think for many years we've been training people and sending them abroad. I think we may be in an era where people are being trained abroad and coming here. We've got a lot of marvelous young scholars, and I didn't sort of try to put together any numbers about that. But in terms of good news, they haven't vanished from places like University of Utrecht and Netherlands, or the Erasmus University, and a variety of other and Aarhus University that I visited in Denmark last June. We got a lot of great scholars around the world. So those are all pieces of the good news. Now let me get to the bad news that I want to talk about, and that is vanishing public administration. And the slide here, and I'm not sure if you can see it over there, but refers to, in the U.S. we have these continuing conversations about how public administration is vanishing. Now I think there was an era maybe in the 70s or 80s where people were hoping it would go away completely, but that's not the case. So what do I mean by vanishing public administration? Well, I want to talk about three senses in which PA has been projected or could be seen as vanishing. And I say PA, that's my shorthand for public administration. Real erosion of administrative capacity, which here I'm calling substance or substantive. The abandonment of public administration by leading higher education institutions, institutional. With which I've had a little experience myself, having been a UCI professor in the days of this Graduate School of Administration when we had, and Graduate School of Management when we offered both a BA, MBA and an MPA, and at one time did those two jointly. And then erosion of ideas to address challenges of public service, which I'm referring here as ideational. So the question is, what are the arguments associated with each one of these forms of vanishing public administration? And the other thing I want to talk about is to what extent do I give them or judge that they have credibility, or are they sort of have some legitimacy behind them, some strength behind them. Let me start with the first one. And for those of you that aren't, most of you are probably familiar with Paul Volcker, who was the chair of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors in the late 1970s, early 1980s. He was the person that helped put the chokehold, I think, on inflation in the period of stagflation, where we had low growth and high inflation, and where I think I left California, or left Fountain Valley and moved to a home in Irvine. I had a chance to pay an 11% interest rate. Some of you may remember those days, sadly, but fortunately it didn't survive forever. But Volcker, who we gave a lecture at Woodrow Wilson School in what they call the Good Governance Lecture Series. It appears in PAR in the July-August issue of last year, which was really the announcement of something called the Volcker Alliance. The Volcker Alliance is all about trying to sort of serve as a corrective for what Volcker would probably say is our failing governance structure and governance system. The question he tried to answer in that lecture was, are U.S. governing bodies meeting the needs of our citizens? And his answer was very interesting. He said, this can be a short speech. The answer is no. Not very promising. But he said quite simply, they are not meeting the needs of our citizens. Now, what's the indictment here? I think the indictment, distilling and boiling it down, is government's lost its capacity to execute public policies and implement public programs. Now, if you look at the language, some of the language is interesting because they don't want to necessarily abandon the public policy schools in the conversation here, but they refer to, rather than the old language we might have used at one time as program implementation or policy implementation, they refer to policy execution as partly as a way of sort of calling attention to the people who are interested in policy to say, hey, there's more to policy than designing the policy. There's really the execution of the policy. And we're not doing very good at that. We've lost our capacity. Volcker basically says how much attention is being paid to how to get something done, to practically implement big ideas. We're not paying much attention to that. So that's sort of the core of this argument about vanishing public administration with respect to the substantive case. That is, the loss of capacity for policy execution. Now, Volcker refers to a lot of cases or anecdotes. I've listed some here. One that we're all familiar with, healthcare.gov implementation, where we couldn't get the website right. The federal exchange system was just not working and operating. You would think after several years of trying to implement this piece of legislation, they would have been able to get at least that right. If we got nothing else right, they would have been able to get that right. But that was something for which we had a long lead time. We didn't get it right. An example of failed capacity to successfully execute our public policies. Another example, FEMA's, I put in parentheses here, lack of response to Hurricane Katrina. Gulf of Mexico offshore oil spill. Another one near and dear to Volcker's heart because of his involvement in the Federal Reserve was financial regulation and supervision leading to the Great Recession. Volcker loves to quote Edison, where Edison sort of wades in on this policy execution issue, saying, inspiration, it should be without, okay, see, I found an error. Without execution is hallucination, you know. So you can be inspired as you can in a salon, right? But if you can't execute it, you're in deep trouble. Now, the second sort of, and I want to sort of flow through each of these before I sort of make some judgments about their legitimacy or credibility. Public administration has, the institutional argument is, public administration has fallen out of favor, replaced by glamorous public policy programs. Now, I don't want to overstate that. Those of us who were, I'm a Maxwell graduate, circa 1974, and about the time I left Maxwell, we had sort of the rise of the policy programs. And there was, would it be called dissing, I guess? So there would be sort of dissing of the PA people by the policy people, and maybe silence on the part of the PA people about the perspectives of the policy people. In any event, you know, there was sort of this divide. The policy folks were going to ride to the rescue. So public administration programs had fallen out of favor. There's a point, though, that Volcker also makes, as he's a Princeton graduate. The Robertson family sued Princeton University largely because of their gift from a 1961 endowment based on the sale of A&P supermarkets or grocery stores. I think about them as supermarkets, grocery stores, to train students for careers in government. And the Robertson family went after Princeton University and said, "You're not training people for government." They eventually settled the suit. There's no distinction here who won or who lost, although I think the Robertson family would say they won. I think the other, this is no relation. No. Our future is safe. If Peter could sort of say, "Oh, that's my family." Yes. Princeton still walked away, I think, with at least $700 million that were continuing proceeds. But they created a new foundation. Princeton had to pay the court costs for the Robertson family. It's sort of an indication, very concrete, of people saying, yeah, the policy schools have abandoned attention to public administration. The family that gave the money to Princeton has said, hey, listen, you're not training people for government. You're training them for doing a variety of diffuse things, maybe on the fringe of government, but not at the core enterprise of what the execution of public policy and public programs is all about. And then we can sort of point to a variety of prestigious universities. And here I listed, and I don't see somebody in the audience, but I added Michigan here because I didn't want to make sure if I left your university out, excuse me, but Berkeley, Chicago, Harvard, Michigan, Princeton, they're all among the policy schools. And we had the ASPA conference in Chicago recently, and I met the dean of the Harris School. I'm a graduate of public affairs as an undergraduate from the University of Chicago. And I was the 20 years preceding the creation of the Harris School. I was the public affairs graduate in 1970, and they didn't create the Harris School until I think sometime in the 90s. And so I sort of identified with the institution, but the dean is a game theorist. And he was happy to sort of welcome the public administration folks to the conference. And we actually met at 1313 East 60th Street, which is called, what at one time was called the Public Administration Clearinghouse. And the Public Administration Clearinghouse was where the American Society was created by Louis Brownlow of the Brownlow Commission under Franklin Roosevelt, was the first home of the American Society for Public Administration, the home of the International City County Management Association. It's the place where Clarence Ridley worked with Herbert Simon in developing their sort of famous paper on efficiency that they published in 1937. But there's not much presence, and again, this is maybe sort of a concrete manifestation, maybe the separation between policy schools and public administration. The first editor-in-chief of Public Administration Review, Leonard White, chaired professor at University of Chicago. Herbert Simon studied at the University of Chicago. 1313 was created there. But now there's really sort of almost a complete separation between what the Harris School does and an interest in public administration. Certainly, this is part and parcel of Paul Volcker's argument. Volcker not only is talking about the loss of capacity to execute policy, but he's also talking about who's responsible for that. And Volcker, to some extent, lays that at the feet of some of the policy schools for diverting attention from the study, research, and valuing of public administration. Again, these are the arguments for vanishing, not the arguments against these, but I'll get to that in a minute. So that's the institutional argument. The third is what I call ideational, and I hope I have the terminology right here, but theory and scholarship about public administration has not kept pace with the challenges of public service. We probably can have a conversation about that as we proceed, but I have a sort of a couple of elements to that case here. First, as an interdisciplinary field, public administration has bounded itself from the disciplines. And by that I mean is to some extent we become a silo, an interdisciplinary silo. Now some of this is based on my experience as editor of Public Administration Review. Somebody comes to me and says, I did a literature review on networks, but I didn't find anything in the public administration literature. Therefore, there's nothing been done on this. I say, wait, did you read Social Networks? Oh, no, that's not the public administration literature. So, my concern is that we've sort of bounded ourselves looking inward and sort of ignoring that which is going, it's an interdisciplinary field, but we've become so highly developed with our own set of journals. And again, Public Administration Review was just about the only ball game in town in 1970, certainly 1980, beginning in 1990, though we had other journals, but ARPA's been around for a while in a couple of different manifestations. But we have, for instance, we have American Review of Public Administration and International Public Management Journal and Journal of Public Administration Research and Theory and J-PART and on, Asia Pacific Journal of Public Administration. And we can well sort of stay within that boundary, never get out of it. Then the question is, what are we losing in terms of knowledge? Now, my argument would be that we're losing a lot, and that's one reason why we're not keeping pace with the challenges of public service. Now, the other part of it is, the other argument I'm making here is recent lines of research have been marginally useful, especially for the ultimate goal of executing complex policies and programs. That's a little bit less well-grounded, but Jan and I talked about this, don't let it outside the room. I've done research on collaboration, but others have done research on collaboration. The most cited paper, I think, at least in terms of Google Scholar, is on collaborative governance. And I'm looking at all the places that cite and connect with that paper. And what I find is there's very little substance flowing from that original paper on collaborative governance. And part of the reason, I think, is that it's sort of like a peak association. There's a connection to collaborative governance, but there's really no knowledge development underlying. And one of the questions that I posed to you, perhaps for conversation later, is to what extent has the sort of the new knowledge or new directions we've taken over, let's say, the last 20 years, including collaborative governance, sort of moved us, or the hollow state or a variety of other things, moved us in a direction that have generated any useful new knowledge or lines of research that are increasing our capacity to generate usable knowledge for public service. I'd love to hear that we've got some things out there, but my argument would be that we're probably a lot thinner there than we should be, and part of it is maybe a statement about the inability to generate cumulative research readily in this sort of field where that's much closer to herding cats in terms of trying to sort of move people in the same direction and get some collective contributions as opposed to, and the other argument here is the disciplines have been bystanders, bounded from public administration by the wrong mix of incentives and disinterested in problem-centered research. Now that again may be an overstatement, but I'm not sure it's a big overstatement, and I'm certainly happy to hear arguments to the contrary. Part of my experience here is also based on, again, as editor-chief of Public Administration Review, I get notifications when somebody cites some of my research. And I've been recently getting notifications of economists citing my research. And I say, hey, I'd like to publish that in Public Administration Review because I think it's going to add to the debate. They say, no. We can't do that. We need to publish in an econ journal. And I've actually solicited job talk papers that are very good experiments that mesh much better with the collective knowledge that's being and interests and problems that are developed in public administration than they do in the mother field like economics. And they say, no, and as a matter of fact, I can't even get an answer to an email. Now, I take that as sort of saying, it's not worth sort of having a conversation with these people about what I'm doing, because what's important is publishing in an econ journal and capturing that audience and getting that assistant professor job in economics. And sort of that I sort of interpret as troubling, but it adds significantly to this vacuum that's created partly from public administration looking inward only, and the disciplinary journals being bounded by their own fields and not sort of trying to cross over. So that's clearly, I think, one of the a potential problem we have. And in terms of vanishing public administration, that's sort of the final piece of this sort of ideational argument of what I associate with vanishing. Now, let me talk a little bit about judgments about each one of these three sets of claims. Administrative capacity is a plausible explanation, I think, for some high-profile failures, although probably far fewer. I think about healthcare.gov. Now, I'm not quite sure what went wrong there. I'm sure the Kennedy School will come up with a case study for us and explain it all, right? But I think we can probably look at that and say, yes, there were some failures there, whether it was in the procurement process, whether it was people talking with one another, people willing to sort of cut across organizational boundaries, that may have been a problem of administrative systems, infrastructure, leadership that we may well associate with the people high up in that organization. But Hurricane Katrina, that may have been well beyond our capacity. I'm not sure that Brownie and FEMA were the only sources of problem there. Clearly some of the other issues that Volcker and others point to, I think, have maybe a partial or peripheral connection to public administration, but not a deep association with the workings of public administration. As I suggest here in the sort of the second piece, the administrative capacity is only one of many causes of governance failures. And of course, you all probably have your theories about governance failure and who's responsible for that. But I suspect if we were having a seminar now, rather than a salon, that we sort of list out a whole series of things that were consequential, that are consequential to our governance failures. And you probably are familiar with a variety of other contributions in that area. Now, the other thing is that, and I was going back, Jim Ferris reminded me of a piece that I think maybe I had consulted in preparing, but it's a 1967 paper in the journal Policy Analysis and Management by Don Stokes. He wasn't then the dean of the Woodrow Wilson School, but he had been the dean of the Woodrow Wilson School, a well-known scholar, influential in public affairs. One of the things I think Stokes pointed to is we really have a sort of a federal fetish, a federal fascination, but there's a lot of other things besides the federal government. One of the books that we commented on at the Academy of Management last year was Richard Wilson's book on public administration. Wilson is a retired city manager of Santa Cruz, and Wilson basically said, we need to get reacquainted with management. But the problem was not so much local government, which is probably relatively, at least Wilson would argue, relatively well served by the city management movement. Of course, I have this identical twin brother who is a 37-year city manager, so I get to hear all I want to hear about city management from him. He doesn't believe it's a local government problem. But so when we look at public administration, we need to say, well, where are these problems occurring? Most, for instance, of Volcker's anecdotes or examples are Katrina, which actually was an intergovernmental failure to the extent it was. But some of those were certainly federal, or the Gulf oil spill, another sort of one that might be laid at the feet of the feds. And then the other point I think that's worth making here is the substantive claim may be another example of what I call American exceptionalism, although I looked up what American exceptionalism is for those of you that are experts on American exceptionalism, but it says usually used in a positive way, but I'm not using it in a positive way here, right? I spent too much time in Hong Kong, too much time in China, too much time in Korea, too much time in Denmark. I go to Denmark, for instance, and not only do they run government pretty well there, but they also can do a lot of good research. And so when I sort of look at some of these other places, the results are a lot different. And people are wringing their hands less about, for instance, the substantive ability to execute public policies. So those are some sort of general comments about the substantive claims. Institutional claims. Blaming the policy schools ignores the small proportion of degrees they grant relative to the MPA, even after 4 decades of the MPP. Now, I may be misstating that, and I think I may be using numbers that only refer to accredited programs. But, I'm looking at the NASPA charts, the bar charts, and the bar for the MPA is something like this, and the bar for the MPP is something like that. Now, maybe we need to believe that the MPPs coming out of Princeton and Chicago and other places are so much more consequential in their organizations than the MPAs. I'm not believing that. I know some MPPs from Chicago who are not working in the public sector anymore, not consequential. But this is one thing that struck me. I was involved in the first Volcker Commission in the late 80s, where U.S. federal employment is something like 2 million people at the time. The number of MPAs, MPPs in the federal government in the late 1980s, 11,000. So we're talking about a small wart on the whole body there. It's just a small, I shouldn't call it a wart though, should I? Just small numbers. So I'm not believing the argument that our capacity or ability to sort of that we've been sort of taken down the wrong path by pursuing the MPP, partly because we're not placing so many students with either MPA or MPPs. Now, again, that's the federal government. Local governments may be different. So we certainly need to be sensitive to that. But I'm also thinking one of the other things that I think about but have not acted on is how many lawyers do we have in the federal government or any other level of government? We got more lawyers, many of them who are not working as lawyers, but people with legal training in our public organizations at all levels of government than we have people who are graduating with specialized training in public service or public administration, public affairs. So I'm suggesting here that I wouldn't attribute the performance failures in any way, shape, or form to the graduates from these programs. And then governments with high representations of public administration professionals are most effective. Now, I may be overstating that, but I like to think that to the extent that local government is seen as our most effective level of government, it's probably also the most highly populated with people who are professionally trained from our programs, whether it be USC or Maxwell or Northern Illinois University or University of Kansas or any other place, that the proportion of professionals, public professionals, in the local government context may be part of the explanation for why they do better overall with respect to executing policies, designing programs, and doing other things that we associate with public administration. Now let me get to the third, judgments about the ideational claims. This is the one that I've sort of put the most stock in. Interdisciplinary silos create barriers to knowledge advancement. Very annoying for me as the editor-in-chief of Public Administration Review to confront authors who don't want to look beyond the interdiscipline, who think only in terms of the public administration literature. Now, one way I learned that was because when I started my research career, I was studying public sector collective bargaining in the 1970s. There was about zero literature on public sector collective bargaining in the early 1970s. That was an easy literature review to write. Right? But, you know, my chair didn't sort of leave me with that as sort of the simple end result. He said, well, there's game theory, there's conflict theory, there's sociology, there's a whole bunch of stuff going on in the disciplines that need to be integrated into the research on public sector collective bargaining. And ultimately, the piece out of that dissertation was published in the American Political Science Review. So it wasn't like sort of what was done there sort of ignored entirely what was going on in the disciplines. Obviously, had to be one of the reasons why it had some currency in one of the leading disciplinary journals. It was also a sure way never to know that that article would never be cited again, because putting a public administration piece in the leading political science journal, which was far less obscure in 1976 than it is today, or at some period in the interim. But in any case, that's sort of another story probably. Disciplinary balkanization further limits knowledge advancement. And then here's a sort of a summary across the three, although again, narrative summary. Governance failures can seldom be placed at the feet of public administration. Policy execution and implementation flourishes where professional public administration has flourished rather than vanished. And then finally, in the broader public administration community, we failed in the arena of ideas and evidence, the arena over which we have the most control. That is, if we want to sort of get a closer connection between practice and theory and knowledge, we can control that within our schools of public affairs and administration, within our promotion and tenure processes, within our journals and the like. So that, I think, is sort of a critical consideration for thinking about where we go next. Now, what should we do about it? That is, I'm basically saying the substantive, to me, is not a compelling argument. If we have serious governance failures, the blame for those serious governance failures needs to be spread broadly. And I personally tend to start with our political institutions. But what would I know about governance failures in political institutions when I'm from the state of Indiana? My sister-in-law used to be was the commissioner of education for Kansas, so this sort of runs in the family, you know. Crazies in Kansas, crazies in Indiana, so, we know craziness when we see it. First of all, one argument I would make, and these are some broad arguments, and we can certainly talk about details. We need to define research more broadly as discovery, integration, and application. Now, I think that's an issue in public administration and not merely in the disciplines. That is that, and let me take the other premier journal, or the other almost premier, the Journal of Public Administration, Research and Theory. They sort of prize themselves on this notion of discovering new knowledge. Is there a lot of attention there to integration or application? I don't want to say there's none, but I would say those are sort of two dimensions where the public administration research isn't engaged in the context of that particular journal. I think as a field, particularly as a field that aspires to be applied or practical in some way, that doesn't negate, I think, the utility of theory, but what it suggests is we need to find ways of marrying theory and our more rigorous and sometimes fairly esoteric research. The other issue that I think is a real critical problem, that's integration. We've generated so much knowledge with all these new journals that we're sort of falling over one another to produce these fairly narrow pieces of research without taking stock of what we've developed and what we know. And I think that's critical. I see doctoral students around the room say, yeah. Clearly it would make your examination process easier, wouldn't it? You know, I've always sort of prized myself in my own personal career about trying to integrate the research that's come before what I do. And I think that's absolutely critical going forward. We've tried to do some things at PAR to sort of advance that process, but now the terminology I use here, discovery, integration, application, isn't my own terminology. The president of the Carnegie Endowment for Teaching came up with produced an article about 1996 or 97 called Scholarship Reconsidered, or Scholarship Redefined, something along those lines. Basically, the fourth form of scholarship he talked about was the scholarship of teaching, which I haven't put up here. Obviously, that might be a relevant scholarship. But the important point is that scholarship is not merely discovery. It's also integration of ideas and prior research, and it's also the application of those ideas. And I think that's absolutely critical for a field like public administration. Structure and motivation for our scholarship. I sort of see public administration and the disciplines as sort of being in two different extremes, and somehow we need to find a middle ground. Excuse me. We need to be less exclusively problem-driven in public administration. Now, when public administration review drove me crazy in the 70s, and when I was sort of a developing scholar in the 70s and 80s, it drove me crazy in part because what was important to be published was the latest problem. Somebody had a problem, let's publish it. We need to get this out for the practitioners. Now, that problem may be gone tomorrow and may have no longevity, but that was irrelevant. Sort of the question is, how do we create some continuity in the research that in the knowledge that we developed? And so even as an applied professional area, we need to be thinking about how we sort of establish the foundations for continuity over time. We've not been very attentive to that in public administration. Now on the disciplinary side, we need to find ways of infusing more questions of practical importance into the disciplinary journals to sort of try to create some balance between the disciplines which may focus on their concepts, rigorous research, and maybe fairly esoteric stuff, particularly for practitioners, and on the other extreme, the tendency of some people and many public administration scholars, I shouldn't say many, but in the old days maybe many, people who have since passed or retired or whatever, that were sort of focused on the latest problem when dealing with the latest problem was not a way of sort of creating knowledge that would be useful to future scholars, future practitioners. We need to find some ways for crossover between public administration and the disciplines. One of the things we do now at Public Administration Review are systematic reviews. Although I told somebody at lunch today, we're interested in meta-analyses. Meta-analysis is a technical and statistical review of prior research. The last meta-analysis that in 1985, I wrote an article said we need to do more meta-analyses that appeared in Public Administration Review. Since that 1985 article, Public Administration Review has published one meta-analysis in 30 years. I'd like to make that routine. You can't go into the medical research these days without seeing a meta-analysis of, let's say, studies of breast cancer or whatever and treatments of breast cancer, or a variety of other interventions of practical importance to patients and doctors, professionals in the medical profession. We need to sort of think about ourselves in the same way and how we can embrace that integration of material. We're also interested in systematic reviews, but the purpose for the systematic review is to say, and the example I use of collaborative governance, and if I probably won't offend you on this, but the JPART published a piece in 2008, right? That has tons of Google Scholar hits on it. The most successful issue in the history of public administration review was the issue on collaboration, which your Bin Chen used some of the content from that in his dissertation, which was published in Public Administration Review in 2006. Very successful. Matter of fact, 4 of the top 75 articles in the history of the journal come from that issue. Interestingly, not one of those articles or any other article from that symposium in 2006 is cited in the 2008 article. How is that possible? I don't know, it's the vanity of one journal versus another or what, but it's problematic. That's one reason why I read every article before we publish it in PAR. And I'm on the lookout for gaps. Of course, our reviewers are too. Sometimes the reviewers may not be aware of sort of gaps that I'm aware of, but clearly I think we're letting the whole profession down, we're letting our colleagues down if we don't sort of integrate this research into the process when we're doing our new studies. And PA scholarship must become less insular. Now, I think there are a lot of ways of dealing with that. For instance, you've got a PhD program. Do you have a requirement for an outside minor?
Outside minor, I don't think it's a requirement.
Ah, okay. So our public affairs PhD at SPIA has a requirement for an outside minor. If we want students to be crossing over from the interdiscipline to the discipline, we probably have to have some conversation between public administration and sociology or political science, and one way to get it is in the design of the PhD program. I'm not sort of critiquing yours. I thought you were going to say yes. Yeah. But now, one of the things I do know about USC is you hire a lot of people into disciplines, which is good. That's another way of making sure that your doctoral students are not sort of simply talking to those of us who have been trained in PA, but you're talking to someone who's trained in economics or sociology or elsewhere. So there are a variety of ways of sort of making that connection. The general point is, though, we need to find ways of reducing the insularity. We also need to be thinking about building and strengthening practitioner-researcher ties. One example of that I'm very pleased with, proud of, is the piece that involves one of your faculty, former Indiana University professor Bill Resch. That's coming out in Public Administration Review, May, June. I suggest you read it. But it's on the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey. And the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey actually dates back to 1979. Why do I know that? Because I was using the survey in 1979 was called the Federal Employee Attitude Survey, and it was created by Scotty Campbell when the Office of Personnel Management was created. It morphed into the Federal Human Capital Survey. Now it's the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey. And the feds are using it, beginning to use it extensively for the management of federal organizations, enhancing employee engagement, a variety of other things that are now mandated for federal executives. The survey, unfortunately, and the logic behind it and its integration between the practitioner and the scholar is very poor. 40 studies, as the article you'll read that will be online in the next 2 weeks, when you read it, will point out 40 peer review articles have been published from that database, most of them in the last 10 years. That's a fair bit of literature, 40 studies on one database. The Office of Personnel Management didn't know about one of them, didn't have a clue. So here we got the feds generating all these survey data, using it primarily for practice, including designating the best places to work in the federal government, but ignoring completely the scholarly community. And so part of our purpose for commissioning the article from Bill and his collaborators was to put out the scholar perspective, saying we can do a lot better. Of course, the thing I knew in 1979 was a lot of the survey items in the survey were not highly valid, right? So one thing you don't want to do with surveys is use invalid items. They don't give you, sort of like garbage in, garbage out, right? Not only have those items not changed since 1979, they've been written into statute. Something like 45 or 47 items in the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey are required statutorily. Now, the reason for that, I think, is probably because of the National Treasury Employees Union and other employee unions saying, if you're going to be asking questions of federal employees, we want to make sure you get questions in there like, how satisfied are you with your job? How good is your supervisor? So that those things can be tracked. The other thing we discovered that's also revealed subtly in a commentary by the research director at OPM was that, how many of you are familiar with the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey? Okay. Cross-sectional, annual cross-sectional survey or panel data? Cross-sectional. 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 Not true. Not true. The OPM has identifiers on all the respondents. You can put together a panel. Until Bill and his colleagues wrote that in the article, OPM didn't say a word. Now, there are a variety of reasons whether we're going to be able to get the panels out of it, but when I had the conversation about commissioning this article, I said, you have to press on the panel thing. Why? Because that's going to get us good data. It's going to get us the opportunity, for instance, to track people over time, to know what difference interventions to improve leadership programs and develop senior executives make in the federal civil service. So I'm hoping that sort of putting all this in the light of day is going to sort of bring together practitioners and scholars. The other thing it's going to do is that if we can systematically get a panel, we're not going to have only public administration scholars or the people within the public administration community doing that, but sociologists and psychologists and a variety of others will be using it. Yeah, right.
So in principle, it could be a panel, but it's not in practice.
No, it's not in practice. Not yet. Not yet. But the research director from OPM referred to the panel in her comment on the article.
Yeah, we should talk more about it.
Yeah, okay, sure. But see, building Rome starts with, the first block, right? So, like I said, they're still using the survey items from '79. It goes back a long way. And then creation of forums that advance mutual interest between practitioners and scholars. I suspect we have those, but we probably don't have as many as we need, and I don't have any specific suggestions there, but certainly that's something we need to be thinking about. Or in the conversation over lunch, part of my, or one of my comments was that I see public administration review as a sort of a big tent, and it's owned by the American Society for Public Administration. But I'd like to see many practitioners, whether it be International City County Management Association or National League of Cities, to look to PAR, at least in part, for answering questions that are important to them and their constituencies. One of the things we have tried to do, given the affinity between ICMA and the journal, and the fact that I have this identical twin brother who is a city manager, so I had to do something for him subtly. He'd never done anything for me, but yeah, he's a good guy. Mark met him, yeah. Was to do 4 articles in honor of the 100th anniversary, trying to sort of lay out some details about future research and the like, and sort of synthesizing some information that might be useful for the city management profession. I'm almost done. Filling gaps between research and our educational. Now this goes back to the Stokes chart. One of the interesting things, I went back to this yesterday after Jim Ferris mentioned it to me. Stokes talked about 5 waves of public administration, public management, public policy. The 5th wave, and this is in 1996, he talked about 5 areas: financial management, political analysis, legal analysis, ethical analysis, and negotiation. Now 2 areas I think we have maybe a pretty good grasp of: negotiation, although we don't talk about it a lot with a distinctively public context, and financial management. Some of these other areas, like political, legal, and particularly ethical analysis, I think we've been essentially moribund, particularly with regard to ethical analysis. As the editor of PAR, I've repeatedly tried to solicit high-quality research on ethics. It's being done in other fields, but we don't have anybody sort of putting together both sort of a normative foundation nor a explanatory foundation for understanding and thinking about ethics research and practice in the public sector. The other thing I put that sort of next to is we published an article last May on corruption and the financial effects of corruption. Since between May 1 and the end of December, we had 25,000 downloads on that one article alone. Now the other thing I didn't mention that I'll mention in passing now is that Public Administration Review in 2014 passed the 1 million download mark. That is, in that year we had 1 million downloads of our articles. That's a fairly robust attention to what we published over the years. Part of it's saying that the Simons and the Lindblums and others are still consequential and important to folks either in teaching or thinking about the field. But it also says something about this corruption piece, I think, says something about how the public sort of values attention to good government, which was sort of the foundation of public administration going back to the 1930s, and I don't think we've escaped that today. Another area I think we are very under-researched on is public leadership research, and it's been confined mainly to mimicking and replicating corporate research. If you look at our 75 most influential articles, although again, Janet may, I won't say disagree, but you may have another take on this, and it might be useful to hear that. we don't have a lot that's leadership per se, although let's say the new public service may have, there may be spin-offs or ideas related to leadership. I commissioned an article to sort of look at the leadership research for the 75th anniversary, and also to try to lay out a research agenda. It's one of the 12 articles I commissioned that the author dropped out. So not promising to me, again, trying to fill these holes. And again, you may say, well, this guy's absolutely crazy in terms of expecting one article to make that much difference. But again, if you go back to my 50th anniversary article on public service motivation, slow start after that, but now the article gets lots of attention, and we had 130 peer-reviewed articles on public service motivation since 2008. So it may not have generated a lot of attention until we sort of until I created a scale to measure it that was published in 1996. But one good article and sort of the right development of it can make a big difference in the long run. And one of the things I think is that we have a lot to say about leadership that gets lost in the babble coming out of business schools and the corporate sector. And there are facets of leadership, like collective leadership or public leadership, where we need to be part of that conversation and then generate the knowledge that'll flow out of our field. Not only, we should not be merely the receptors of ideas from elsewhere as this sort of interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary. We need to also be generating new knowledge and ideas that sort of are transportable or exportable to other locations. And then finally, and I'm not going to say more about this, but I have this view that I say here, explore using public service professionalism as a frame for unifying public values, ethics, practice, and scholarship. Dwight Waldo, and I did a call for articles on for the 75th anniversary of ASPA, and I got 40 proposals for articles on public service professionalism. We commissioned about 20 papers. Maybe about 15 were submitted, and 2 passed muster. So that's 1 out of 20 from the original numbers, very small numbers. Part of it, I think, is related to the fact that we're not comfortable thinking about public administration in professional terms, but I think we need to frame public administration in professional terms. Now, is public administration only one profession? No. The question is, how does it sort of fit? How do the professions that what Frederick Mosier talked about, the professions in 1968 book, the New Public Service, how do they sort of all come together, and what are sort of the ethical obligations and sort of the moral connections across those professions, and how do they behaviorally get played out in public service, and what might be the sort of the hierarchy of commitments. But we need a robust research on professionalism in public contexts, which we're not getting at all. I would say generally, although I tend to associate professionalism with sociology, we're not getting much out of sociology either. But maybe we could certainly be the engine. And I think some clarity about professionalism and how we want to think about it in a public context would help us think about values, would help us think about ethics, would help us think about scholarship that would advance our ability to bring everybody together in public service. In these, one of the things that Stokes talked about, and we've all talked about, are these sort of new complex service arrangements. But I think that, in that context, I think we need to be thinking about, what is professionalism in that context? What are our obligations? Clearly, we even if we thought historically about public professionals, when we've outsourced all the work to the private sector, the question is, do we expect those people to be thinking about their public obligations in the same way we think about our public obligations? Now, one example, the Australian national, or the Australian government, I think, created a statute, I think going back as far as 1998, that said, when you contract things out, you don't contract the values out. You don't contract the ethical obligations out. You may put them on a different cost footing and a different efficiency footing, but you don't contract out certain public values. That hasn't been our sort of way of thinking about the world, but it may be useful to sort of frame public and have sort of a robust analytic framework associated with public service professionalism that helps us think about what values are lost, what are gained, and what sort of the trade-offs are in those contexts, but also to help us think about doing research and accumulating ideas over a variety of studies. And hey, that's it. I'm done. Janet, yeah.
There is just so much here.
Well, Jan gave me broad sweep here, so.
Well, thank you for being here. Thank you for taking us through this. There's a lot to worry about here. And I do worry. I just make a couple points and then ask a question. You're talking about Australia. If you look at the countries of the world that led in the privatization, contracting out movement, a lot of them have reversed the legislation to promote that and have begun to focus on administrative capacity. And you've been talking a lot about building administrative capacity. Second, I would agree with you that there's not enough on public leadership. But the third thing I want to say and ask you about is I really appreciate the role that scholarship and publication plays in laying the foundation for the field. One of the things that concerns me most, and I don't know what we need to do about, is that, as you point out, we're producing more MPAs than MPPAs. But the scholars we're producing are more in the field of public policy than in public administration. Who's going to teach in those MPA programs? Certainly, practitioners have a great deal that they can offer. You don't see this, as you point out, so much in local government, but PA theory, PA, generally speaking as a field, is not producing a lot of doctoral students. What can we do about that? Do we need to be concerned about that? Can the other disciplines fill in?
Yeah, I wish I had sort of an answer for that, although, of course, we do have professors of practice, right?
Well, yeah, and that's very important, but
Yeah.
you might also need some other folks.
Yeah. Well, if I were, I need to be a little bit careful. I don't want what I say because I don't want to. One general comment I made was that I made to my brother last week. My brother and I were together on a theory practice symposium. He is the 37-year city manager and me is the 40-year academic. But and I said, some of these places wouldn't be placing their PhD students if there were sort of a robust turnout of students, development of students at the upper level institutions. One of the things although this is probably why USC is not able to fill some of its positions, right? You say, well, here are the 10 places from which we accept somebody in PA. If they come from these other ones, we're not, we're going to toss those on the side. Even if they look outstanding, we probably can't hire them. Now, economics, I think, I know at UC Irvine, when I was at UC Irvine, I think we were turning out people in economics, but there were only like 6 economic programs in the country where PhDs could get jobs at the major universities, and if they weren't coming from one of those programs, they didn't get. So we already have that sort of structure in place, but I see places where I wouldn't expect people to be, from which I wouldn't expect people to be easily placeable in public administration jobs. So that concerns me. It also concerns me about sort of now maybe they're gifted people and maybe they're going to do well. I don't know, but I think it sort of reaffirms though my experience is consistent with your concern. I think we need to start filling out. Now, I see some of these things though, as, I won't say self-correcting, but as correcting over time. That is that to the extent that, Paul Volcker and others sort of stand up and say, we're not creating people to execute policies, and we need people with sort of administrative or skills about public and knowledge of public administration as we've understood it traditionally, even if they're sort of trying to translate it into the current language and research, that maybe that will sort of bring some resolution from places. Part of it is also maybe related to the demographics of the academy. That is, we had an enormous, I'm retired. Rich, you're retired, right? Yeah, so we have the old guard retiring, but we're retiring at faster rates than we can sort of produce new PhDs in those areas to replace us. So and maybe that'll correct over time. I'm not sure, but so I think there's some legitimate concern there about which we have to give. Now, maybe the USCs and the Indianas and some of the other places will redouble their efforts to turn out quality PhDs. The thing we don't have any control over, though, is when students come to us, even though we may recruit them in X area, they may drift over in somewhere else or whatever. Here's the other issue, though. PhD students are doing research and moving to the glamour areas or to the hot areas. And that's not necessarily serving our knowledge requirements. I'm saying, why is everybody doing research on public service motivation? We don't need that much research on public service motivation. We don't need that much research on networks. Everybody has gravitated. You sort of, if you go, for instance, if you've gone to the last 5 public management research conferences, one year it was networks, then the next year it was collaboration, then the next time it was public service motivation. And those sort of 3 or 4 or 5 areas have sort of rolled through to dominate the stuff that's coming to our journals. People have to say, wait, somebody needs to mentor me, and I need to sort of get my head around doing high quality ethics research. I want to become the person who's going to define ethics research in the mid-21st century. We don't have anybody like that coming along. So we got to find ways of getting those people who are going to lead the way and move people out of these areas where everybody's fleeing so quickly because they think that's the hot topic. Because the other thing is that by the time people are able to actualize their plans, the hot topic is something over which I got too many manuscripts at par, and all the good stuff is already, all the good findings have already been published, and the other stuff tends to be just secondary replications. I don't want to sort of overstate that, but clearly we need to sort of think about those processes over time and somehow steering people away from sort of giving too much attention. This is what, the problem of herding cats or whatever you want to call it is sort of one of the issues we confront. Thank you, Jan. Yeah.
So, may I ask a question?
Sure.
So it's, I think you kind of touched
Make
on
it easy though.
kind of touched on it, but didn't go deep into it. Is the issue about globalization or internationalization of the field of public administration. There are 2 aspects to it. One is about research, as I understand, say, even within public administration review, compare, say, with 20 years ago, I'm sure you are getting a lot of manuscript from scholars from overseas. So want to sort of get a sense of how you sort of kind of deal with this issue about how to make it sort of a common forum for people from both inside and outside the U.S. as sort of a shared conversation on some core issues. So I want you to comment on that. The second has to do with how to relate that back to teaching, because many MPA programs are now attracting students from overseas, right? So our MPA program now is about half of them from overseas. So I would say if we rely on any one major PA textbooks in the US and use that for that class, it's very difficult for students from overseas to really understand the relevance. So I want you to comment on these both aspects. from
Yeah.
your vantage point.
When you find a solution to this problem, let me know.
No
Yeah.
solution.
That's something I've struggled with as editor of PAR because, but I've given some presentations. I went to, I think it's TASPA, it's the Taiwan Association for Public Administration Education, which is a combination of NASPA and ASPA. It's got both the schools involved as well as the individual scholars. And I gave a talk on globalizing public administration research. I think we need to find, again, some ways of framing that so we can have some common conversations. I've seen some movement. We actually have a piece that may or may not make it, but from scholars from U.S. and Korea, trying to sort of think about how we might go about this process of globalizing PA. The reality is that we've done this, tried to do this before. Remember you may not remember it, the comparative administration movement. You remember probably, Rich, the comparative administration group of the Indiana was heavily involved. Fred Riggs and Bill Siffin and others, and the Ford Foundation threw money into it. But it was a very much sort of, I would say, straight, fairly abstract, straight political science. It didn't necessarily connect with the practice. Of course, those were probably in the days before we had a lot of attention to public management and the public administration practice. But I think we need to sort of find some ways of connecting. And one of the things I tried to do when I started as PAR editor is to say, what issues have some universal appeal? I'd at least like to see research on questions of universal appeal. Now, the corruption article about corruption in the American states we published last May probably got downloaded not only because of interest across the American states, and we marked it free, but there's probably, I need to check on the downloads in China. I suspect that there were probably some downloads in China associated with interest and attention to corruption there. But corruption, I think, sort of as a universal concern. Another area is transparency. We've had some comparative pieces on transparency, including an experiment between Netherlands and Korea. So, one way for me to attack it is to say, okay, we can have a conversation across countries because transparency is important in Korea, it's important in the US, it's important maybe in China, I don't know, although to some extent it probably is, and elsewhere. So that's a concept or an idea around which we can have a universal conversation. We need to find more of those. At the same time, I'm reading some of the stuff coming to me from the Europeans, for instance, where they're talking about concepts that don't have any connection with the American audience. And I'm thinking to myself, is there sort of a universal here that we ought to be searching for? If there is, we haven't found it. That is that the Europeans have their language and they've identified something that's salient to them. It may not sort of generate any interest over here. So I'm trying to sort of find some ways of sort of connecting across these geographic locations. Now the other area is methodology. The European Group of Public Administration had 17 papers on experimental public administration as presented at a symposium last fall. We did a call for papers on experimental public administration. We got 40 submissions. These are submissions not only from the original 17, but from a lot of other people from around the world, some of them very good. So I think one way to sort of unify our conversation may be around methods, possibly. Clearly, and I've had conversations, for instance, with a colleague at Milan, at Bocconi University, and he came to Indiana, and he's also working with Xi'an University in China and another university about having 4-country experiments. And so and focusing on the same, let's say, administrative intervention, performance pay or what have you, and to look at the commonalities there. So, there are ways of which we can sort of knit together, and I don't have any sort of one one best way. But I think we need to be searching for. Now, the other thing I note, I accepted 2 papers from Korean scholars recently. You know how these papers were different from previous papers from Korean scholars? One of my former Korean students is back there. Son, tell me, how were they different?
I'm sorry, I don't have any.
No idea, okay, yeah. They were different because they were based on data collected in Korea. They weren't about data collected in California or Washington. I say, this is a breakthrough. We've got, scholars from Korea doing research that is on Korea, looking at things that theoretically, I think this was on budget transparency or whatever, theoretically have a connection with other parts of the world, but they're not using American data. So that's a breakthrough. So this is going to be, 2 steps forward, 1 step back sort of process, I think, or it's going to be a lot of baby steps. But I think we're moving in the right direction. When we're going to get a breakthrough, I'm not sure, but I think I'm looking for people to sort of send articles to me that are going to sort of help unify this scholarship cross-nationally. Now, the other thing is we got a lot of databases. We published a piece on altruism last year that was grounded in the public service motivation research by economists from Erasmus University that was focused on 32 countries or 33 countries using a World Values Survey. That's not just one country, it's multiple countries. It's sort of talking about ideas that have currency around the world. So we're developing, and some people have looked, for instance, and said, well, the public service motivation stuff may be as far as anybody's gone in terms of trying to internationalize something. But maybe we need 3, 4, 5 areas that sort of move us in that direction. Teaching, to the extent, for instance, that these articles that are written by Koreans that use Korea data, they might be more salient. But I don't think I have a perfect answer for that one, but I think the other thing is that public administration review, though, is less Americentric.
Compared with 20
right.
years ago. Maybe
Yeah,
let's
yeah.
have one more question. So
Yeah.
we're about a few minutes left before the wine.
First of all, thank you for being here.
Yeah.
And I am one of those pesky lawyers that you mentioned.
Did I say pesky lawyers?
But my question is, this is very interesting to me that every narrative that I hear from various scholars in public administration choose to speak about the governing bodies that are the furthest away from the daily lives of citizens that we serve. And not focus more on local governance, which is, as you correctly pointed out, substantially different than the experience that local would have at the federal level. What do we need to do in order to get more attention or pay more attention to your identical twin brother? And move perhaps to a more effective way of governing, because I don't know how many times you've spoken to your congressman in the last 30 days, but I have seen a constituent of mine, or I have spoken to a constituent of mine every day in the last 30 days in local governance. So how do we kind of change the narrative and go to an established form of governance that is working, and what can we learn from that governance?
Well, yeah, that sort of presumes, though, that talking about that one form of government or governance that's working sort of negates all the negatives associated with the others. We are a federal system. Certainly local governments are an administrative entity of the state, so that they have much sort of more limited capacity, and are also closer to citizens and may address a much smaller set of questions that are more manageable by the administrators there. I don't think that means we should ignore state level or clearly the Indiana situation the last 48 hours is an example that states are important too. They're going to have a big consequence for sales tax revenue, the health of local governments, and a variety of others. And so we need all these levels to sort of work effectively. And clearly, a lot of what I think happens is at the federal level, although I think we do tend to give too much attention there, happens to be quite visible, for better or worse. And we got our national news that are not going to the. Although I think they probably should have gone and asked some telling questions of the city manager of Ferguson, Missouri. I asked my brother about this. I said, John, this guy's been city manager for 7 years. He was hired because he was a local, although he had gone to the University of Missouri at St. Louis, I think, MPA program or bachelor's program. So he had some specialized knowledge, but he wasn't highly cosmopolitan, wasn't sort of looking for employment outside the St. Louis area, but he had some role. Of course, he was a cheerleader for the tickets that they kept writing that were, which the African Americans in the community were probably the primary victims. So I don't know. I think we need to be attentive to all levels. One of the other things, we have an article coming out on the council manager plan. I referred to the council manager plan has been in effect for 100 years. Interestingly, we have very little research on the consequences of choosing a council manager plan versus a strong mayor plan versus a commission plan. I thought, and Indiana is the one of 50 states that doesn't have the council manager plan in the state law, that I thought, well, I'm going to go to the International City County Management Association that represents 6,000 city managers, not only in the U.S., but Canada, Australia, and other places, and they're going to be able to tell me why I should be talking to my state legislature to create opportunities for a council manager plan, and maybe why we ought to implement that at the local level. They don't have that information. So one reason for our publishing the article is to sort of tell everybody what's not there. But just because local government works doesn't mean that we don't want state and federal government to work. They all really have sort of different domains of activity for the most part. And if we don't get them all working, we all come out on the short end.
Info